Well, why I got interested in architecture in the first place, I think it's a question that is for me important to respond, because I could have been interested in journalism, or I could have been very interested in history. And I think that for me, what makes architecture so exciting is that it's intervening the way reality is produced through a deep understanding of how we got here and what is the potential for the future. And for me, that's something very exciting. It's something that allows to inject intention in the way we collectively consider what are the possibilities that still have not been produced, and what is the way that we can get them available to imagine a different future. And that for me is something very exciting. When I look backwards, I have the feeling that that's what interested me from architecture, this possibility of reading what is happening and work to make the yet to come something that we can produce together. I believe that architecture has a power that for many people, or that many people cannot see. When I was a student in the School of Architecture, once as I presented my thesis, and it was a very big School of Architecture where the director didn't know everyone. So he called me up and said, why you have these amazing grades? Because when I see your work, I cannot understand it. It's a work that is colorful, it's full of things, it's very complex, and honestly very ugly. But then I have all these reports of your faculty and colleagues saying that this work is so important. So tell me what's going on here. And I think there was a fundamental change, a change that I think is now playing a key role in architecture. I was trained in a School of Architecture that was mostly focused on style and beauty, understood as something that was autonomous. But I think that now we're seeing that architecture has the great potential to not that much make things more stylist, but deeply transform the way bodies connect with other bodies, with realities, with machines, with environments, with climate, and constitute the togetherness that we as societies and ecosystems share. And I think this is something that is not about just replicating what exists in a more stylish version, but rather deeply intervene the structures by which we constitute ourselves as a collective. And that for me is a very different way of doing architecture. So those that are kind of expecting that architecture is just business as usual, but in a, let's say, more delicate way, are very frustrated when they see that the effort is put in actually inject and reconstruct society in different ways of working and different values. Architecture is not hosting society. I think that often we have this metaphor, or we activate the metaphor that is like if architecture was providing boxes for society to walk in and step in. But architecture is not like that. There's no way to provide an empty space, a neutral empty space that any type of society or ecosystem or even body can inhabit. I think that my practice and the way I've been doing architecture and writing about it, that it's based on the shift in the way we understand what architecture is. Architecture is actually the way bodies connect to other bodies, connect to other forms of life, how those other forms of life, together with human bodies, are also dependent and interdependent with technologies, how that also expands into landscapes and territories, and how eventually all that produces climates and ecosystems and societies. For me, it's this interconnection and interdependency, the way some bodies infiltrate others, and they are infiltrated by technologies and by other forms of life, how our societies are constituted, and that's what I would call architecture. Architecture is this form of articulation, and that is not just the provision of space. I don't think architecture has anything to do with space. Architecture is about composition. It's about how different forms of life, how different entities are negotiating their coexistence and their mutual construction, co-construction. And I think that is what architecture is about. But this is a definition of architecture that comes from different sources. It comes from political ecology, it comes from the tradition of STS, it comes from queer studies, it comes from transness and trans studies. When we think of architecture as a discipline, we have to acknowledge that it's happening in conversation with many other forms of knowledge. So I would say that disciplines are not, let's say, isolated rooms that get to be kind of getting influences from others or taking things from others and putting them in their box. They are in dialogue, and there's blurred boundaries and intersections. And in those boundaries and intersections, many things happen. And I think the evolution and the change in architecture comes also as a conversation with all these boundaries, where architecture is shaping and contributing to shape others as much as it's being shaped by others. Early in my career, I was very interested in domesticity at large. Why? Because I was trying to explain that domesticity, the spaces that normally are considered very intimate and private, were not actually private. They were crossed and, I would say, mobilized as spaces of politics and spaces of publicness. For instance, when we think how we separate our trash, our waste, that's a fundamental way, something that we do in our kitchens, for instance, that's a fundamental way of participating in the collective construction of ecology. Or for instance, how we make decisions of the way that we create relationship with others. It's a fundamental political act. If we think of the traditions of feminism, the traditions of ecology, and many, many others, they're fundamentally installed in activities, in things, in relationships that are enacted through domestic spaces. But the paradox is that the way modern architecture dealt with the definition of what architecture is, was making it impossible for architects to register these complex relationships that are not defined as something that happens in one space, but as something that is enacted in more complex realities and that have a development through time. This is to say that in modern architecture, publicness was in the streets and in the squares, whereas private life and intimate life was happening in the domestic interiors. By claiming that domesticity is a political space, there were two things that we were doing. One is to pay attention to the complexity architecture was managing through domesticity in itself and confronting many, I would say, mainstream discourse, like the one of IKEA, that we responded with this project, IKEA Disobedience, from my office. But also we were responding to architecture's obsession with separating realities in rooms. For us, publicness is something that is enacted in every single form of architecture. In the same way that intimacy is something that is enacted as much in a bedroom as in a street or in a public space. As we could work more and more and online interaction became much more prominent, we started to see how also domesticity is something that was happening through online interaction. And that's the moment that we started to work, for instance, with projects like the one on Grindr, Intimate Strangers, where we saw that actually domesticity was something that was traveling to other places. The notions of intimacy was no longer installed even in residential infrastructures, but rather in online applications and spaces like the one that Grindr could provide. But there, it was even more complex, because then notions of intimacy were made compatible with notions of exposure to collectiveness, like the one that Grindr could produce. And for me, those are complexities that architecture is now building on, and that is and that are kind of changing the way we think of the world we live. One thing that for me is very important is to acknowledge and identify what are the specific roles and I would say knowledge that architects and architectures can contribute with to the changes the world will face in the next years. And I think that the specific knowledge that architecture has is the capacity to re-articulate how things relate to each other. That's the specific knowledge of architecture. Architects, we know how to reconnect things so that the way they relate to each other, the way they gain solidarity, it's producing something different. For instance, we work on this house that we call the Rambla Climate House. This is a house that is collecting the rainfall and the water, the gray waters from the showers, and using it to reconstruct a dying ravine that is crucial in a huge environment that in the last years it's been seen how these ravines were disappearing. The ravines, the Ramblas, are the infrastructure or the kind of the natural veins where biodiversity is concentrated in these large, very dry ecosystems. A house that can just collect water and use it strategically to repair a ravine that has been dying for decades now is playing a key role, is playing the role of allowing the entire ecosystem to recuperate the biodiversity it needs to function climatically in ways that can stabilize life. It's the role of this house, the role of this architecture is actually not, its role is not creating a new reality, but is transforming the way rainfall relates to the ravines. And by doing that, the entire ecosystem is repaired. So I think that architecture has to very specifically focus on the reparation of relationships that have been lost in processes of exploitation now. I would say that from this perspective, every design is a redesign. There's no way to work on a tabula rasa. And specifically now, a big part of the design is the reconstruction, the reparation of a big part of the relational richness that is being lost through modernization and extractivism in the last centuries. 2 years ago, we completed the construction of the radio school in Madrid, in Spain. It fundamentally was based on 3 principles. The first one is that education is not based on a curriculum, but rather on relating critically to daily experience. So it's how you interrogate where you are, what is happening to you, how you relate to others, how you basically provide to yourself or to a group of people an education. From this perspective, the building is crucial. And the building had to be a building that allowed for curiosity and interrogation. It's a naked building that allows all the processes to be seen. You see the water circulating, you see how the energy is produced, you see what happens to the rainfall, you see how basically nature goes to the building. Everything is an opportunity in a building that is understood not as a, let's say, isolated place to be, let's say, to have the best conditions to concentrate on your studies, but on the contrary, a building that becomes a call for you to pay attention to everything that is happening around you. The second principle of the radio school was the idea that education is not happening in social seclusion, but rather in the relationship with others that are different to you, that are different than you. That was promoted by the very design of the architecture. As opposed to designing a school that would be spread horizontally, and that would then be providing the opportunity for classrooms and other facilities to be embracing and enclosing spaces where kids could play isolated from the rest of society, which is how 90% of school buildings are designed. We did a very vertical building with no playgrounds around it. Kids could be in the building and then they would spread around in a public space. And the public space is the place where kids get educated in the encounter with all people from the neighboring building, which is actually an elder's residency, or with the infrastructures of the city that are very close, that are very present in this area, or with nature, or with the and basically the opposition to this kind of a spread, privatizing, and land enclosing typology of schools to this very vertical, concentrated school that then would allow kids to and faculty to spread and in relationship with others in the public space was fundamentally produced by the architecture. A model of pedagogy that was porous to social interaction would be promoted by the architecture. And the third principle is connected to the second one. If you're using the public space as part of the pedagogy, something should be given in return. And this something given in return was reparation. The public space that surrounds this school is, for me, very beautiful, very exciting, but it's also the result of a long process of neglectance to the land. It was an old landfill that for decades got the trust of the city. Now it's been transformed into a park, but still the levels of biodiversity are very low. There's almost no insects. So the school became an ecological reparative device. In a way that we've been working in many different projects, it basically uses the capacity of the school to collect water and to care and to do very specific biological work to nurture a series of tiny gardens, non-accessible to humans, that are specifically designed in collaboration with ecologists, Álvaro Mínguez and Basarrate, to create the conditions so that very specific communities of insects and birds and many others can be protected and somehow their population increase in the school and then spread through the entire ecosystem. For me, these are three ways of not only addressing the architecture of a school, but any architecture. One that is based on producing collective knowledge by intensifying the capacity of humans to interrogate reality. Two, the idea that societies are produced in the articulation of difference rather than in the creation of exclusiveness. And three, the idea that any device at this point is a reparative ecological device. And if you take these three ideas, you can think that there's a possibility of claim an architecture of care as a paradigm that could be relevant nowadays. The name of our office, Office for Political Innovation, is very intentional. First, because it's claiming that architectural practices are political practices. For me, this is crucial. And the type of politics that we talk are not the politics of political parties. It's not that much of the spoken word, but rather how heterogeneity negotiates its coexistence. This is something that is divisive, that is disputed, that is distributed, that is evolving in time, and that can only be managed through political tools. So for me, claiming that architecture is a political activity is claiming that its mission is to create, let's say, alliances between actors and entities that are very heterogeneous and that otherwise would never be able to collaborate or to gain solidarity. The second part is the innovation. And innovation is something that often is identified as part of the corporate language. For me, putting innovation together with political was where the click was, because innovation is talking about a form of invention that is integrated in societies. So the difference between an invention and an innovation is that the invention needs to travel to redesign societies in order to be considered an innovation that is accepted by many. So I'm trying to bring that process to politics, claiming that there's no possibility of creating a technology that is neutral, but it's always something that requires a political chamber where representation can be brought in. Bringing or kind of stealing innovation from the corporate world and bringing it to politics is what I think architecture can do now. And that you can see on how other fields like engineering or often deals with architecture trying to remove the political dimension of it. I think by removing the political dimension of practices of construction or material design, you're basically removing them from the whole tradition of politics that architecture activates. Well, I think now there's two ways of imagining the future and how architects and architecture will contribute to it. One is thinking of for instance, the culture of sustainability. And sustainability is something that it's allowing us to keep doing business as usual, but changing a few things so that our emissions, our consumptions are adapted to the limits that we're facing. Let's put it this way. I think that's not enough. I think we have to be much more clever in understanding that the crises that we're experiencing now are the result of intersecting paradigms. The intersecting paradigms of carbonization, colonization, racialization, anthropocentrism, technocracy, and patriarchate. We have to understand that all of them work together Carbonization would have been impossible without the colonization of a big part of the world by a small part of the world. That process would have been impossible without the racialization of a big part of the colonized part of the world, and the distinction between the free men, as it was said, and the free illustrated men, and the others that were sacrificable. That could not have been possible without the patriarchate, without the structures of families that were defining genders as binarisms and identifying the role of reproduction as part of one of the genders. And we could go on, and these processes could not unfold without the mobilization of technocracy. The idea that a certain form of knowledge could be imposed to others, for instance, to indigenous knowledge. So when we look at all these things, they work together. So it's not enough to say, now we're going to do LEED certificates for all the buildings, because that's fundamentally a renovation of a big part of those ideologies. What I think we have to acknowledge is that those layers are cracking. It's not possible anymore to think that we could go on carbonizing the world in the same way that we cannot really support a world that is based on colonization or racialization. So what I think is that we have to acknowledge that the crisis that we are experiencing now and facing now are basically the evidence that all these layers of reality are cracking. They're very thin. They're not something that, let's say, is even possible to imagine that will perpetuate. But what is very interesting is that in the cracks are many beautiful things that are growing. There's so much that is happening in the collapse of these systems of exploitation and extraction. Many other forms of care and mutual care that are emerging and that are so exciting. So I'm very optimistic of the capacity of architecture to contribute to reconstruct the world, and to reconstruct the world as a transitioning from a system of extractivism to one of mutual care. I think there is an appetite for that. When I talk to young people that are coming, for instance, to Colombia, they have no questions that this is what they want to work for. They don't want to be star architects, so they really want to contribute to that. And they want to identify who can be their allies and their friends in doing that. And for me, that's a source of optimism. I have the feeling that we will be facing and seeing amazing forms of architecture emerging in the next years.